They called him insane for what he did that afternoon in San Diego. The church was glowing with flowers, white ribbons, and golden light falling from the stained glass windows. Guests filled every pew, whispering, fixing their clothes, waiting for the music to start. It was a wedding made to look perfect, a moment designed to be remembered for its beauty. But perfection shattered the instant a figure appeared at the back of the aisle. The door creaked open, and in stepped a man whose presence did not belong to the scene. His shoes were torn, his jacket stained, his hair silver and unkempt from nights without shelter. He hesitated, clutching the side of the doorway, as the eyes of the crowd turned and narrowed. Murmurs swelled like a tide. Some tilted their heads in pity, others whispered sharp words to the person next to them, and more than a few looked away in disgust. Yet before the ushers could move, before judgment hardened further, the groom himself broke from tradition. Adrian Carter, dressed in his pristine wedding suit, suddenly left the altar. He did not walk slowly. He ran down the aisle. Through the gasps and the whispers, his face was lit not by shame but by something far more powerful: recognition. With no hesitation, Adrian threw his arms around the old man, holding him tight in front of every guest, in front of the polished cameras, waiting to capture only smiles and vows. The church fell silent. Forks of confusion cut through the air. Why would the groom embrace a stranger, a homeless man, on his wedding day? Why would he risk ruining the perfect image so carefully arranged? Some shook their heads, convinced this was a mistake. Others muttered that compassion had blinded him. They could not see what Adrian saw. And then the floor of the church seemed to tremble. The heavy sound of synchronized boots echoed from outside, steady, deliberate, as if belonging to another world. The doors swung open once more. Through them marched 12 Marines in full ceremonial uniform, every step in unison, every movement precise. Their polished shoes struck the stone with a rhythm that filled the space like a heartbeat. They entered not as random intruders, but as if honoring a ceremony older than the vows about to be spoken. Every guest froze. The contrast was staggering. The ragged man clutched by the groom, and the impeccable ranks of soldiers moving forward in formation. It was no accident. It was a revelation. The whispers stopped. The air thickened with awe and confusion. Everyone stared, waiting to understand why this man, dismissed moments ago as worthless, was suddenly surrounded by such reverence. What Adrian knew, and what the crowd was about to learn, was that kindness never vanishes into the void. A simple act done quietly over time can return when least expected, reshaping a life, or even a destiny. This wedding was not just about two men promising their love. It was about how love itself, when given freely, can pull someone out of invisibility and back into the light. If you believe that kindness holds the power to stop a room cold, to silence judgment, and to turn strangers into family, then stay with this story. Because what unfolded in that church did not end with a whisper, it roared into a lesson no guest would ever forget. Follow Heart Story for more stories that remind us of the power within ordinary moments. And comment respect if you know compassion can change everything. Long before the church bells rang, before the whispered shock of guests seeing a groom embrace a man from the street, Adrian Carter had been quietly shaping his own truth. At 32, he was known across San Diego for his craft. The glass display of his bakery was always filled with golden croissants that cracked at the touch, waffles whose sweetness lingered long after the last bite, and cakes layered with precision. Customers praised him, neighbors adored him, and magazines occasionally mentioned his name. From the outside, he appeared to have mastered the recipe for success. Yet what defined Adrian most was not written on menus or captured by photographs. Each morning, while ovens still glowed and the city had not yet woken fully, he performed a ritual no one had asked for. After preparing the first trays of pastries for the day, he would set aside an extra portion, one croissant, still warm, along with a cup of coffee brewed strong enough to chase away the night. He wrapped them carefully, not as leftovers, but as an offering treated with respect, and walked out of the bakery. There, near the bus stop where traffic lights blinked against the dawn, sat an old man whose hair had gone silver and whose jacket bore the wear of countless seasons. He never asked, never begged, never reached for coins. He simply sat, eyes lowered, body drawn into itself like someone trying to disappear. Adrian would place the food gently beside him, offer the smallest of nods, and walk back without demand for thanks. The man, in return, would sometimes lift his head just enough to return the gesture. This quiet exchange became a rhythm, as consistent as the rising of the sun. Days grew into weeks, weeks into years. People noticed. Co-workers at the bakery laughed about it during breaks, whispering that Adrian was wasting the finest pastries on someone who would never appreciate them. A new manager even confronted him once, warning that such behavior could damage the image of a boutique bakery that wanted to be associated with elegance, not pity. The words stung, but they did not stop him. Adrian never argued, never defended himself with long explanations. Deep inside, he knew what his eyes had taught him. The man sitting at that bench was not a shadow, not a burden to be pitied, but a human being who deserved dignity. He had seen too often how society erased those who had nothing. He himself, as a gay man in a city that was not always kind, knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be spoken of as though you were not truly present. That recognition gave his ritual its power. He did not see a homeless man. He saw someone who deserved to be acknowledged. As the years passed, this habit became part of Adrian's identity, though it was never mentioned on menus or interviews. It was not charity meant to polish his reputation. It was a vow whispered only to himself that if he could not change the world, he could at least refuse to look away. And beneath the surface, something far greater was happening. Each croissant, each cup of coffee, each wordless nod was building a bridge Adrian could not yet see. The old man remained mostly silent, but there was a weight in his eyes, the weight of someone who carried entire stories untold. By honoring him without conditions, Adrian had unknowingly kept those stories alive, giving breath to a man who might otherwise have vanished completely from memory. The truth about kindness is that it often feels small, almost invisible in the moment. People scoff, dismiss it, or call it weakness. But just like dough rising slowly in the heat, its effect expands quietly until one day it fills the room. Adrian did not yet know that his morning ritual would one day become the heartbeat of his wedding, the turning point that silenced an entire crowd. For now, it was enough that he chose to see humanity where others saw waste. And that is where the deeper lesson rests. When you look at someone and decide to recognize their worth, you are not merely feeding their hunger. You are telling them their existence matters. Sometimes, that belief alone can be the nourishment that keeps them alive long enough for their story to continue. The bakery smelled of sugar, and roasted coffee the night Adrian Carter stayed late, finalizing the last batch of pastries before his wedding. His heart should have been racing with nerves and excitement. Yet what waited in the small pile of letters on his counter changed the rhythm of his thoughts completely. Among the bills and congratulations was an envelope without a return address. The handwriting was shaky, as if carved by hands that had endured storms. Inside was a single line: tomorrow. I will come not for bread, but to settle a debt. Adrian read the words over and over. He knew immediately who had written them. The man from the bench, the quiet figure who had received his pastries for years. The idea of him appearing at the wedding felt impossible, even reckless. Still, the message carried a weight that could not be ignored. Something was about to break open. When the morning arrived, San Diego was bathed in sunlight. The church was draped in white, and the guests arrived dressed in polished suits and dresses. Laughter echoed in corners, cameras flashed, and children fidgeted as music filled the air. The ceremony had not yet begun when a sudden hush swept through the space. At the entrance stood a man no one expected to see in such a place. The old figure had traded his tattered jacket for a faded suit that seemed decades old. The collar was worn, the sleeves slightly frayed, but he stood tall, adjusting his tie as though reclaiming a piece of dignity long forgotten. He clutched the invitation tightly, though the paper trembled in his hand. The whispers began instantly. Who invited him? Does he even belong here? Some covered their mouths, others scoffed openly. A few shifted uncomfortably, as though his presence stained the beauty of the moment. In the eyes of many, he was nothing more than an uninvited intruder. But before judgment hardened, Adrian moved. His breath caught as he stepped away from the altar, leaving behind his groom, Ethan Monroe, a firefighter whose eyes followed every motion with pride rather than fear. Adrian's shoes struck the aisle quickly, his face breaking into a flood of recognition and tears. Without hesitation, he embraced the old man, pressing him tightly against the crisp fabric of his wedding suit. The delicate white cloth absorbed the salt of his tears. But Adrian did not care. In that instant, it was not about appearances or approval. It was about honoring the bond that had lived quietly in the shadows for years. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Some rolled their eyes, muttering words like foolish, reckless, even disgraceful. Others shook their heads, convinced Adrian had ruined his own ceremony by drawing attention to someone they viewed as undeserving. And then, before any of those thoughts could settle, the ground seemed to shake with the sound of heavy boots, rhythmic, unstoppable. A drumbeat of discipline rolling closer with every step. The doors burst open. 12 Marines entered in ceremonial uniform. Their movements in perfect unison, the medals on their chests caught the light, gleaming like mirrors of history. They marched in formation down the aisle, their boots striking the stone with a reverberation that silenced every whisper. The crowd's judgment froze, suspended in awe, as the soldiers aligned themselves with precision, forming a path of honor leading toward the altar. The contrast was overwhelming. The Zion, once dismissed as a shadow in society, now stood embraced by a groom and saluted by a formation of warriors. Though the guests did not yet know the reason, they felt it in their bone. Something sacred was unfolding, something far greater than their gossip or discomfort. In that moment, the air inside the church shifted. What had begun as ridicule was giving way to reverence, though no one could explain it yet. The lesson was simple but powerful. Never be too quick to decide the worth of another human being. The person you judge in silence may one day stand at the center of a truth you cannot deny. The church was motionless. The 12 Marines had halted in flawless formation, their posture rigid, their uniforms gleaming under the fractured light of the stained glass. For a moment it felt as if time had been suspended, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, with measured steps, one of the officers broke from the line. His eyes swept the room, steady and commanding, before he brought his hand to his forehead in a crisp salute. His voice carried across the chapel, not loud but resonant enough to touch every ear. Today we come to honor a man who once saved an entire squad in Fallujah 2 decades ago, and who has survived in silence ever since. This man is Sergeant Nathan Hale. Gasps rippled through the pews. The name struck something in those who remembered old newspaper articles, fragments of broadcasts, mentions of battles far away that most had long since filed away as history. Few would have imagined that the man sitting day after day on a weathered bench, dressed in rags, had once stood under fire, carrying wounded comrades across fields of dust and smoke. The officer continued, his tone unwavering. He earned the Silver Star, yet chose to disappear after losing his wife and child. For years, this hero slipped beyond the edge of society, but he was not forgotten. He was kept alive by the quiet kindness of one man, Adrian Carter, who saw not a vagrant, but a human being worthy of dignity. Adrian's breath caught. He had never asked Nathan his name. He had never pressed to hear his story. All he had offered was a croissant, a cup of coffee, and a nod of recognition each morning. And yet those simple gestures, repeated through years, had been enough to anchor a man who once carried the weight of a battlefield on his shoulders. Adrian could hardly comprehend it. What he thought of as a small act had in fact been a lifeline. The guests sat frozen, the shame of their earlier whispers hanging in the air. Where once there had been smirks, now there was silence so deep that even the flutter of a program dropping to the floor echoed. Heads that had shaken in disapproval now bowed in respect. What had been seen as disgrace had transformed into a lesson unfolding before their eyes. Ethan Monroe, standing at the altar, moved to join Adrian. He reached for his hand with quiet pride, his fingers closing around him with the steadiness of someone who understood what truly mattered. His eyes glistened, not from surprise but from admiration. And in that simple gesture, the meaning of the day became clear. This wedding was not diminished by Nathan's presence. It was enriched, made sacred by the truth revealed. Nathan stood silently as the Marines flanked him, his shoulders squared though his eyes shimmered with unspoken memory. For the first time in years, he was not invisible. He was recognized, not only by the nation he had once served, but by the community he had believed had forgotten him. In that moment, the church did not feel like a stage for photographs or polite conversation. It became something more, an altar of humanity, where kindness, love, and sacrifice wove together. Adrian held Nathan close, still trembling with the realization of what his simple choices had meant. Ethan stood beside him, ready to share the weight. The judgment of the world had turned into honor, and dignity had been restored in the place people least expected. The lesson was undeniable. We rarely know the battles strangers have fought, the scars they carry beneath their silence. To look at someone and dismiss them as unworthy is to blind ourselves to the truth of their story, but to see them, to honor them in the smallest way, can be the difference between despair and survival. Adrian had not set out to rescue a war hero. He had only chosen to treat a man with respect. And through that choice, he reminded everyone present that compassion is not weakness. It is strength disguised in humility, the kind of strength that can restore a lifelong thought lost. The months after the wedding unfolded like the rising of dawn. Adrian Carter and Ethan Monroe chose not to let the extraordinary moment at the church fade into memory. With the money gifted to them by family and friends, they opened a small breakfast cafe in downtown San Diego. They named it the Quiet Table. It was unlike any other restaurant in the city. There were no grand signs, no glossy advertisements. Instead, it held long wooden tables, warm lighting, and a corner reserved specifically for veterans who had lost their footing in life. Each morning, Adrian baked fresh pastries, not for the sake of trend or profit, but as an extension of the ritual that had once anchored a broken man. Ethan, when off duty from the firehouse, welcomed guests with the same compassion he showed in his uniform. They worked side by side, not just as partners in love, but as builders of a place where no one would be invisible again. Word spread quietly. Veterans found their way there, sometimes carrying nothing more than stories they had buried for decades. They ate without judgment, sat without shame, and slowly a community grew around the very table that once stood empty. For Adrian, every nod, every smile was proof that kindness had weight, that it was capable of lifting people who had been pressed down for too long. A year later, on a morning that seemed ordinary, Adrian unlocked the doors to find 12 men waiting outside. It was the Marines who had once marched into his wedding. This time, they wore no uniforms. They stood in simple clothes, each carrying a single flower. Their eyes carried respect, their hands steady as they entered the quiet table. Adrian and Ethan welcomed them, moved beyond words, sensing that this gathering held meaning. On the wall hung a frame, new and polished, holding a document that silenced the room the way the soldier's boots once had. It was a certificate of Nathan Hale's will, finalized before his passing. The words were clear. He had left every bit of his veteran's pension and the small savings that remained to the man who saw me, not as a shadow of Groom, but as a human being, Adrian Carter. Tears blurred Adrian's vision. He pressed his hand against the glass, unable to believe that the man he had once greeted with nothing but bread and coffee had given back everything he had left. Nathan had never wanted recognition, never sought glory for what he had done on the battlefield. He had refused the world's applause. But in death, he chose to pass on his legacy to the one person who had given him something far greater than honor, the dignity of being seen. The Marines laid their flowers one by one, not just for Nathan's memory, but for the truth he represented. In that quiet cafe, surrounded by the scent of butter and coffee, Adrian understood. Every act of kindness ripples outward. It might not be noticed by the world, but it will always land where it is most needed. The lesson breathed itself into the walls of the quiet table. Greatness is not always measured in medals or wealth. Sometimes, it is measured in a croissant wrapped each morning, in a nod of acknowledgement, in a choice to see someone when no one else does. And now, the question lingers for you. If kindness this small can transform a stranger into family, what could your own small act do? Comment respect if you believe compassion can change a life. Follow Heart Stories for more true stories that will remind you of the extraordinary power hidden inside ordinary choices.